Unlike the other vaults scattered across the Mojave, Vault 22 was never meant to cradle a civilian population. Its halls were not designed for families or children, but for scientists. Men and women tasked with solving one of humanity's oldest hungers: to tame the Earth's crops and make them thrive where famine reigned. A weather sign still stands near the great blast door, its lettering boasting of the work within. Fertilizers that could rejuvenate barren soil. Stalks of wheat and corn bred to withstand insects, drought, and disease. Yields so vast, they promised to feed nations. Vault 22 was not a shelter from the coming firestorm. It was humanity's gamble against starvation. A laboratory carved into the stone where life itself was to be engineered and perfected. When the Great War burned the world above, the doors of Vault 22 sealed tight, and the scientists within turned fully to their purpose. Cut off from the surface, they poured their knowledge and lives into coaxing greenery from steel and stone. Vast chambers bloomed with crops, grain, fruit, and vegetables, all intended to sustain the community of researchers who had become both caretakers and test subjects of their own work. Many of their ambitious projects drew on designs gifted or quietly sold by pre-war defense contractors. Experiments meant to secure humanity's future in a starving world. Yet among those many gifts entrusted to Vault 22, one carried the seed of disaster. It came in the form of Beauveria mordicana, a fungal creation born not of nature, but of human design. Conceived as a weapon against famine's enemies, it was a fungus, crafted to turn the tiniest pests into walking husks. When a host brushed against the spores, the invasion began. The fungus threaded its way through the muscle and organ alike, colonizing the body from within until the victim's own functions failed. But death was not the end. In time, the fungus seized the host's very motor control, animating the carcass like a grotesque puppet. These shambling carriers wandered the soil, scattering spores into the air, each step spreading the infection further. Researchers observed that while the fungus was brutally effective, it was not swift. Its kill took 10 to 20 days, and its reach faltered when faced with solitary creatures less prone to contact. The samples that would spell Vault 22's fate did not begin here. They were first cultivated in the hidden greenhouses of the X-22 Botanical Gardens at Big MT. An echo of pre-war ambition. From there, they were passed along to Vault-Tec as part of its ever-expanding catalog of advanced botanical experiments. To the scientists sealed within the Mojave's green vault, it was a gift of possibility. Like so many creations born within the Big MT's shadow, the fungus proved to be less a miracle than a curse. An organic Pandora's box that the scientists of Vault 22 unwittingly unsealed. It was meant as nothing more than a tool for long-term pest control. The truth was known even before the war, in the hidden laboratories where it was first grown, that the fungus could infect more than insects. It could take root in humans as well. Within the sealed halls of the vault, the experiments pressed forward. The spores, invisible and patient, began to drift through the corridors of filtration systems, inhaled by the very researchers who sought to master them. The first to fall was Dr. Harrison Peters. His notes became both a warning and a chronicle of the infection's ghastly progression. What began as a bout of pneumonia soon sharpened into chills, a fever, and a cough so violent it left him gasping for air. Standard antifungal treatments failed, rejected by a body not reshaped by its invader. Peter's lungs and then his organs collapsed under the relentless spread of the colony. Death, when it came, was no mercy. For the fungus did not stop with the body's stillness. From the hollowed shell of its host, it grew stronger, claiming muscle and bone until the corpse itself lurched back into its motion. These spore carriers, twisted parodies of the people they once were, roamed the vault's green-lit caverns with a single purpose: to scatter more spores, to claim more flesh. The scientists, brilliant though they were, found themselves powerless, before the infections advance. Treatments failed, quarantines broke, and the invisible plague spread like wildfire through the laboratories and gardens that had once promised salvation. Vault 22, the Green Vault, had become a tomb of creeping, hungry life. As the infection spread unchecked, the fragile order of Vault 22 unraveled. Friends, colleagues, and family members were transformed into spore carriers, their bodies shambling weapons of contagion. The very air itself had turned traitor, thick with drifting spores that promised a slow, inevitable death to those who still clung to life. In desperation, the surviving scientists devised one final gambit. If fire had burnt the world above into ruin, perhaps fire could cleanse their own. Gas lines were deliberately vented into the lower levels. The plan was simple in its grim intent: ignite the atmosphere, burn away the infestation, and sacrifice the gardens they had built in hope of salvation. But desperation breeds mistakes. Something, perhaps the scent of the gas, perhaps the movements of the survivors themselves, provoked the spore carriers into a frenzy. Instead of fire cleansing the vault, the scientists were met with a tide of rage. The creatures swarmed through the corridors, tearing into the would-be arsonists before their plan could be carried out. The fires never came. The infestation endured, and with the last resistance crushed beneath its advance, Vault 22 fell silent, overrun by its own creation. By the year 2096, life in Vault 22 had been extinguished. The last cries of the uninfected had long since faded, leaving only silence and the slow, patient growth of the fungus. The dead did not remain still. Many rose again as spore carriers, hollow shells driven by the will of the colony. Others, too far consumed, never moved at all, flesh and bone collapsing into grotesque, stationary growths that clung to walls, floors, and ceilings like tumors of living mold. The Green Vault had achieved its purpose in a twisted fashion. It was no longer a sanctuary of agriculture, but a sealed garden of death. Every chamber overtaken by choking vines and fungal blooms, every shadow hiding something that once was human. By 2096, Vault 22 was abandoned, not by choice, but by inevitability. The living were gone, and only the fungus endured. Not all of Vault 22 perished within its poison halls. A remnant of 118 survivors broke away, abandoning the fungal tomb behind them. They marched north, through the wastes, across broken roads and silent valleys, until they reached the red stone cliffs of Zion Canyon. There they stumbled upon another band of the lost. Refugees who had wandered north of Mexico, weary and desperate. Numbers alone did not decide what followed. The vault dwellers had carried more than their training into the canyons. They carried discipline, tactics, and weapons scavenged or preserved from their flight. Against these, the refugees had little defense. On February 11th, the survivors of Vault 22 struck. The camp of the Mexicans were torn apart in fire and blood. The men were gunned down. The women and children who resisted met the same fate. Those who lived were not spared in mercy. They were dragged back to the Vault Dwellers' camp, corralled like livestock behind crude barricades. The survivors of Vault 22, once scientists and seekers of life, had become conquerors. High above the blood-stained floor of Zion Canyon, a lone man watched. Randall Clark, a former soldier turned survivalist. From the rocks and shadows, he bore witness to the slaughter of the Mexican refugees and the cruelty that followed. Desperation gnawed at him. He wanted to help, to save those still breathing. For 2 days, Clark scouted the intruders. The Vault 22 survivors were no scattered rabble. Patrols sweeping the ridges, sentries posted at every path into their camp. Only the stream, winding quietly and narrow, lay unguarded. Yet something about them struck him as strange. The hollow cough that racked many of their throats. A wet, rasping sound he mistook for the wasting sickness of tuberculosis. He pushed the unease aside, focused his sight on the survivors he thought still lived. On February 14th, Clark slipped into their camp under cover of night, clutching to hope. What he found instead shattered it. The prisoners were gone, their bodies butchered, flesh roasted over fires, bones discarded like refuse. The vault dwellers had not simply killed their captives, they had consumed them. Something broke inside him then. The soldier who had once laid his rifle aside took it up again. Clark declared war, alone, against these abominations that emerged from Vault 22. He struck from the shadows, a phantom of vengeance. Rifles barked from the cliffs, explosions echoed through the canyons. He rigged the corpses of his enemies with traps, reclaiming their weapons and ammunition to refuel his campaign. By the close of February, Brandon Clark had carved his vengeance into the ranks of the Vault 22 survivors. 24 of the original 118 lay dead, picked off one by one in ambushes, explosions, and traps sprung from the canyon shadows. Clark himself only suffered a single wound, 10mm steel-jacketed round that tore through his thigh. By sheer fortune, it had missed the femoral artery, leaving him wounded but alive. The survivors never saw his face. To them, he was a phantom, a ghost that struck unseen. Yet even a ghost could not remain still forever. On March 2nd, a patrol of the dwellers stumbled upon the cave he had been using as refuge. One of them triggered a deadfall trap at the entrance, crushed in an instant. The others panicked, fired blindly into the darkness, the rounds sparking off stone, one shot nearly finding Clark where he was crouched. When the echoes faded, he emerged to finish what the trap had begun, leaving no one alive to report what they had found. But the close call forced him into motion. Abandoning his compromised shelter, Clark gathered his supplies and made the trek to Cheva Garche, a deeper refuge within Zion. There, in the silence of the cave, the survivalist nursed his wound and sharpened his resolve. The war was far from over. By the time 10 months had passed, the vault dwellers were broken. Once a disciplined force of more than 100, they had been whittled down to a starving, terrified remnant. Over 80 of their number had fallen, to sickness, to the unseen hunter in the cliffs, or to the madness that gnawed them from within. The canyon had become a graveyard, and desperation drove them to unthinkable acts. They fed on their own dead, carving what little sustenance they could from the corpses before abandoning the fires and fleeing Zion. What became of them beyond the canyon's walls is a mystery. They vanished into the wastes, leaving behind only echoes. Now and then, prospectors would stumble upon the relics of their exodus: damaged pit boys, shredded Vault 22 jumpsuits, scraps that spoke of a people consumed by something more terrible than hunger. But in Zion itself, the memory endured in another form: the Sorrows tribe, who came to call the canyon home generations later, knew the story through the voice of a man they revered as the father in the caves. Randall Clark's warnings and tales passed into legend, retold across firesides and carried down the years. By 2281, his story lived still in the tribe's cliffside murals, a lone figure wielding a weapon that spat lightning, striking down skull-faced horrors marked with the number 22. Thus the fate of Vault 22's children became both a forgotten tragedy and a remembered warning. A story of hunger, madness, and vengeance etched into stone.